Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, all the women are gone. I don't know why. I think it's a major issue in the aerospace industry. There's definitely not enough women. When we are talking about female entrepreneur, maybe I know a couple of them. Out of the, I didn't do the math, but out of the 200 startups that we've been accelerating the last 3 years, I can think of maybe 5 or let's see, a handful of handful of entrepreneur, which is clearly not enough. And so I hope that with the talk that I'm gonna give you, I'm gonna, motivate or inspire more women entrepreneur and basically more entrepreneur. And so thank you for attending. It's not going to be a regular or typical VC talk, but more trying to explain what's happening right now in the aerospace industry, because a lot of things are happening, and just want to share that with you, and yeah, push you or motivate you to join that journey. And so just as a first question, just think of a car about 60 years ago and how a car would look at that time. Probably about this. And a car right now, especially in our Silicon Valley environment, is more looking like this. And now think about the same thing for the aerospace industry and for just a commercial aircraft. The train industry has been also pretty much evolving a lot. The semiconductors, also the last 60 years, nothing would exist at that time, and now we have sensors and chips everywhere. But now think about aviation and aerospace. Can you tell me, so based on the paintings, you can guess this a little bit, but which one of the two is the oldest, and what's the real difference between the two of them? Honestly, not much. Engines are still about the same. The cabin doesn't make any much improvements. Consumption is about the same. Speed is about the same. And even when you listen to Tom Enders, the CEO of Airbus, aircraft are still designed pretty much the same, and that's a big issue. When you think about previous innovations, this is the Concorde. The Concorde does not exist anymore. We used to fly from Paris to New York in 3 hours. It's not the case anymore. The space shuttle it should be a great innovation. It's a great way to go to the international space stations. Now you have to use a capsule, and then you land with a parachute in the water. It's a mess. And so the aerospace industry over the last 60 years come up with great innovations, but not that much in the last 10 to 15 years. When you look at the way you design the wing of an aircraft, the materials have changed, but basically the way it's structured, and if you are a mechanical engineer, it's pretty much the same equations for the last 100 years. And there's been less, at least to my point of view, less innovation in the aerospace industry because of this. For some reason, the life of a person in a plane is so much more important than in the car, which make that a commercial airplane so safe right now compared to any other vehicles or ways of transportation. And there's even a joke, whether it's Airbus or Boeing, how to make a plane safer. It's called the pilot and the dog, and basically each time the pilot is trying to touch something, the dog is supposed to bite him. And that's today the only way to make plane safer and more reliable is to take out the human factor and make it fully autonomous. In the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a couple of entrepreneurs, famous or not. I'm sure you all heard about SpaceX and Elon Musk, especially here. But Do you know how much SpaceX is worth today? What's their last valuations? They're worth about 25 billion. The equivalent from the legacy corporates are worth much less. Skybox, acquired by Google, and then bought again by Planet, was sold for 500 millions. Ugo is a new type of in-flight entertainment, much more sexy, user-friendly. And then Explicit, another startup that is developing new type of seats, much lighter and much more comfortable. But basically what these guys have done is that they have demonstrated that space or aerospace is not used to be about innovations or invention, a bunch of tech guys trying to come up with new products. Now they demonstrate that it's possible to bring innovations, lower the barrier, and actually make money out of this, and not just a couple of thousand, but millions and billions. And that was a big shock for the legacy industry, a big discovery also for the VC world, that under certain circumstances, there was a way to invest in these new type of startups and actually make money. And when you look right now at what's happening in the cockpit, with an iPad, you have much more computing power than everything that is under the cockpit, that is doing the navigations, the communications. They are still using computers from the not the 80s, but the 90s or late 90s. So there's a huge need for innovation, for disruption into that industry. And as I said, we used to, in the aerospace industry, we used to talk about inventors. Now with the Elon guys and others, we are more talking about innovators that are transforming goals from these innovations. And even right now, we talked a lot about the A380. But the F380, in terms of number of people that they are carrying, it's just a little bit more than the 747 that was developed 50 years ago. So in terms of pure innovation, it's not a big deal. And these recent aircraft from Boeing or Airbus, and they're about the same, they're supposed to have to put a lot of innovation in their plane, but at the end they are reaching out pretty much the same performance than 40 years ago. And basically what we've seen in these large corporations, and it's exactly the same in aerospace, is that engineers inside these organizations as good as the one in these startups. The only thing that they are not allowed to disrupt themselves, or they are not allowed to develop the product that they would like to inside these organizations. And that's why we've seen so many new people leaving this organization and starting their own company. And as I said, we haven't seen that many innovation from the large corporation in the last 15 years. As a human being, we've the sky is also the synonym of freedom, and so when the products that are supposed to be developed are not, then we are pushed to do it ourselves. And that's been the case in the ancient time. Leonardo da Vinci was a great inventor. And about a century ago, that was the beginning of aviation. And it's interesting as we look back in time. It's like there's a 60 years cycle where we come up with new innovation. It's not semiconductors. It's different time cycle, but we are entering right now into a new kind of era. That was in 1906, the first air show that was in Paris. There was a big competition between Europe and the US who would fly the fastest, the furthest, who would cross the Atlantic the first. In the late 50s or 60s, Sputnik was the first satellites, Apollo missions, walking on the moons, developing the space station. There was a new era of mostly of innovation, mostly pushed by the Cold War, but a lot by government funds, and was against a great area. What I think right now is that we are entering into a new area, like we entered 60 years ago and a century ago. When you look at investment in that area, and when you look just at venture, the last 15 years have been pretty low. The last 3 years have been pretty high. The average amount of VC money put into the aerospace startups has been averaging 2 to 3 billion the last 3 years. And so 2 to 3 billion is not that much. When you look at total VC money across the globe, it's probably around 150 to 200 billions. So that's 1 or 2% of money invested in that area. So it's still, as a VC, it's still a niche. You need to understand a bit more what's going on. You need more competencies to invest in this type of startups than in investing in an app or investing in social media or something different. It's not scalable the same way. As soon as you develop another product, it costs a lot. It's not a software that you duplicate, but it's clearly a trend. We've been working for the last 3 years with 300 startups, and I just want to illustrate a few of them, just to give you a sense of what's really happening now. It's not a dream, it's not a fantasy. We are actually working with NASA. There's a lot of different groups with Uber and a lot of startups to build the next flying car. And I like to say that the next autonomous car will be flying, and it's for so many reasons. It's much easier to develop an autonomous flying car than just an autonomous car on the road, and it solved so many problems. But so these guys, there are Swedes flying out of Dubai, but there's actually a couple of other startups that are developing what we call Jetpack, and Jetpack today that are fully autonomous. You step in, it's like it's fully autonomous now. They develop product that you can go from point A to point B, 10 to 12 minutes of autonomy, and it's very convenient. Flyke, it's a Slovakian startup, but actually same thing. There's about 20 of them, some in US, UK, Russia, and others that are developing the next Star Wars vehicle. They can work right now. It's stable. They have more around 5 to 10 minutes autonomy, and again it's coming. It's a bit a different concept. It's some kind of a low cost flying vehicle, but also very efficient, a lot of autonomy, and able to achieve a lot of different missions. The new type of flying car, interesting, not solving so many transportation issues, but interesting to see that it's coming. Terrafugia out of Boston and MIT, they are pivoting and trying to do something else. XTI, it's interesting. So when you look at what's happening in aerospace, there's 7 or 8 sectors that are really hot. We talked about air mobility or air taxi, short distance. And there's also a new trend around regional aircraft, 5 to 10 seats that have different capabilities, whether they are hybrid, electric, or with vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. And basically, everybody wants to save minutes of your time, minutes of your commute, because at the end, what's most valuable is less money and it's more time. So the equation here that everybody's trying to solve, and we'll talk about also SpaceX in another way, is how much is worth 1 minute of your time, of your commute, and how can we reduce that drastically so you're going to be willing to pay for this type of new service in order to have more time for yourself. Z, as we are in the Bay, I'm sure some of you know them. They've been around for a long time, trying to figure out that their products. These are not easy products. Batteries are bringing a lot of weight. Putting smaller blades on this type of vehicle. It has to compete with helicopters. Think of helicopters and the size they need. Trying to reduce everything is not easy and doesn't work all the time. And so their first design was a little bit tricky. But they have so much money from Google that they are very active. Urban Aeronautics is an Israeli startup using 2 turbines, and they want to be the rescue drones on the combat fields to bring back injured soldiers in an autonomous way. Very interesting, very complex, expensive, but that's the type of a new drone. And then there's 2 interesting startups, or at least 2 interesting domain that I like to point out. Lilium out of Germany. They recently raised more than $100 million. And so for aerospace startups, we are starting to talk about big numbers. It was not the case in the past, except a few of them. Now we are seeing much more. And Aerion, and there's also a few more. They want to reinvent the supersonic transport. The first one they want to achieve that old movie, the Fifth Element from the 90s. And my point is, it's really happening. In less than 2 years, we've seen almost 0 startups to more than 50 of them across the globe, and we've seen a couple of them raising more than 100 million. So when you see these numbers, you know that something is happening. The batteries are getting better thanks to Tesla and some others. Autonomous is coming also from drones, from the cheapest semiconductors and chips. And we are close to now to having this type of product on the market. We are talking with the regulators. The FAA wants to certify this type of product by 2020. If so, then these people will be able to certify their product in 1 or 2 years. And so you can think of having this vehicle on the market in 2022, 2023. And with a ramp up, whether it's industrial or on the commercial side. So by 2025, you should see a lot of these new services emerging in cities like LA, for example, Dallas for the US, maybe New York between Manhattan and JFK, or other countries that need it the most. And then you can think about Sao Paulo, for example. That has the largest helicopter fleet. There's more than 400. They have already 400 pads in the city, and so you can see these vehicles already flying and providing services. And so they made their first flights last year on a tiny bit smaller vehicle than what they want to achieve, but they are on track, hiring a lot and developing their full-size vehicle. And then the Concorde, of course, everybody is dreaming of the Concorde. You have to imagine that airplane was developed with no computer, no electronic on board. Everything was either mechanic, hydraulic, or in some cases analog. And it was designed by hand on a piece of paper. Now, designing the same things with all the technologies, the computers, the software, simulation that we have is taking, I didn't do the math, but probably 1,000 times less hours of computation than it used to in the past. So developing these type of products, I'm not saying that it's easy, but it's much simpler than it was 50 years ago. And so we talk about Aerion. They just signed an agreement with Lockheed Martin and GE. Lockheed Martin on the aerostructure, GE for the engines. And then Boom, of course, they went through Y Combinator. They raised around 40 millions. And Spike just got funded by NASA to develop a low noise sonic boom, so you can still fly these vehicles above the ground and not just above the oceans. And then aerospace, we talked a lot about aviation, but there's so many things also happening in space. SpaceX, of course, Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos, but there's hundreds of startups that are behind them, pushing, developing new type of rockets, new type of vehicle to land on the moon or to land on Mars. And then you can ask yourself what the business model for these guys. And it's kind of tricky as an investor to think of how are they going to make money by shipping product on the moon. That's kind of hard sell. We can see that there's a few ones that are trying to that are almost achieving this new type of business model. The long term is about at least one of the long term is about asteroid minings. So mining asteroids and bring products back to Earth, and making money out of it. The other thing is there's a new trend of what can we manufacture in space and bring back to Earth. And we've seen a couple of startups that are coming up with ideas, almost products, almost business case that are starting to make sense. When you think about space, main thing is zero gravity, and under zero gravity, you are able to manufacture products or type of agriculture or medicines that have different properties than on the Earth. And so people are starting to think of space. Right now we have one space station and probably 10 astronauts at a time. Maybe in 10 to 15 years, I believe less in populating Mars because there's so many issues around that. But having 10,000 people in space in low Earth orbits, manufacturing product and bringing them back to space, that's a real, very feasible scenarios. And so, yeah, and then now that there's hundreds of startups developing this product, whether they're going to be used as they think or as a technology or an enabler for a commercial space stations or a cheap vehicle to achieve that, or to go to an asteroids and bring back water to that space stations. That's something that is feasible. And made in space, they're very interesting. They're based right here. They just come up with a product that is a fiber optics. When you manufacture fiber optics in space under the 0G, you come up with a fiber that have much better properties in terms of noise reductions and capabilities to increase the bandwidth. And Bigelow, they are testing their module on the space station right now, or at least for the last year, to maybe developed in a couple of years the next space station. And then behind SpaceX, behind Blue Origins, we counted last year about 50 startups from across the globe. Rocket Lab being one of the most known between the US and New Zealand, but there's so much more. And in space is also about communications, also about observations. And we've seen, again, so many inspiring projects, whether they are run by large corporations or by startups. And these new constellations, again, hundreds of them are emerging, and it's fascinating. So my point is, it's really happening now. It's the beginning of a new era. We discovered biotech in about 15 years ago, and it was the beginning of a trend. People were realizing that innovation were not just coming from these big labs or big pharmaceutical company, but the innovation was also coming from the outside. Biotech, fintech, green tech. I think now what we are seeing is the beginning of a new era in aerospace. aerospace tech. I don't know if it's a word, but it's really a new trend where we're going to see much more innovation coming from entrepreneurs, coming from startups, and again, it's just the beginning. At Starburst, we started as an accelerator. We bring startups basically in that area from seed to Series A. We help them raise money, connect to the VCs that have an interest in that area. And we are also becoming investors ourselves. And to make sure that in the next coming years, we won't be able to show that picture anymore, but more something like this. Thank you. Any questions?
So with startups making apps and software, it's kind of an easy sell to customers and VCs. People generally get it. In aerospace, it's an order of magnitude more technical, more difficult. How are they going to communicate that to funders and to customers, or are they just going to be limited to the funders and customers that know what they're talking about?
So yes, you need to find people that are passionate about this. It's still, as an investor, a tricky game. We've seen, development cycle getting reduced, getting less expensive. The end game, the final markets, it's still tricky. You still have a couple of hurdles related to certification, bringing this product to the markets. We've seen SpaceX achieving these milestones, and so we think that other people are going to be able to do that. And VCs, a few of them made money out of SpaceX and are willing to reinvest. We are raising money also to invest in these new type of startups.
Out of curiosity, have you seen any really interesting innovations when it comes to levitation, like how we actually get in the air? I saw there was a bunch of different types of propellers, but propellers as it's in itself, like we've been using for the last 50 type years. Have you seen anything interesting in that space?
Magnetic elevation is still complicated and needs some very, very low temperature, so it's still a challenge. The other thing is about nuclear fusions. We are seeing in labs some kind of new engines based on either separating molecules or merging them. We think that's the future. So far, these engines are not stable more than a couple of a fraction of a second. In the future, they will have the capability to bring us to Mars in a week, but it's still very early and it requires a lot of physics, electronics, and brain.
We don't have time anymore.
Okay. Any questions? I'm going to be around. Thank you.